of our studies in Romans. Romans 1 verses 23, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Title: The Cycles to Depravity. Remember last time we mentioned that Paul was going to illustrate the downward spiral of sin in the form of 3 cycles. Go something like this: perversion, retribution, consequences. The key words again to look for in these statements or these descriptions is God gave them over, a form of judgment. Let's look at verses 23 and 24 for the first cycle. It's a first perversion, and in each perversion there's going to be an exchange. Let's look at verses 23 and 24. And they, that would be those that Paul's been talking about, the pagan Gentiles for the most part, they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for the likeness of the image of mortal man, and birds, and animals, and reptiles. Oh, starting off early today. Therefore God handed them over in the passions of their hearts to uncleanness, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves. So what was the perversion? They exchanged God's glory. They ignored the worship of the true God, choosing symbolic images. Now, the use of images represents a corruption of true worship, and the use of images in worship is the first step toward idolatry. Because remember, even in the golden calf incident back in Exodus at Mount Sinai, they were saying, this is the God that brought you out of Egypt. Their claim was, well, we were just worshiping Yahweh. We needed an image to help us worship. Well, that's the first step into idolatry. And it became full-blown when the northern and southern kingdoms split. Because if you remember, in the northern kingdom, they built 2 temples with golden calves as idols within those temples in an attempt to keep their people from going to Jerusalem to worship. Well, what's the retribution? God gave them over. How did he say it here? Therefore God handed them over in the passions of their hearts. And it's like God saying, you want it, you got it. Now live with it. So that you want it, you got it, always has that follow-up. Now live with it. Of the pagan, this is a visible outpouring of God's wrath. It is God's judgment when he does that, saying, okay, you're going to live with the consequences of what you are doing. And it's related to the immutable law of sowing and reaping. God's judgment was simple: degradation by their own sinful choices from the evil present in their own hearts. In other words, his judgment says, you're going to do evil, you're going to pay the consequences. The discussion then moves from their ungodliness to their behaviors of unrighteousness. It always happens that way. There are immediate consequences for anyone when God gives them over to their own sinful desires. Again, it's as if God is saying, you want it, you got it, now live with it. Or die with it, as the case may be, I suspect. The result, sexual impurity. Idolatry virtually always leads to sexual immorality. Unbridled sexual sin is an early indication of the removal of God's restraining grace, a form of judgment. Believers are specifically told to flee from two sins. Remember what they are? Idolatry and sexual immorality. Let's look at 1 Corinthians 10:14. Therefore, my dear friends, flee from idolatry. And in 1 Corinthians 6:18, backing up 4 chapters, says, flee from sexual immorality. All other sins a man commits are outside his body, but he who sins sexually sins against his own body. And God says, if you do that, you will pay a price for it. Unbridled sexual sin, again, is the first indication of the removal of God's restraining grace. Does this discussion bear any resemblance to our country's sexual revolution of the 60s? Remember, God judges nations as well as individuals. Consider the first 2 commandments. If we go back to Exodus 20, verses 3, 4, and 5. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol in the form of anything in heaven above, or in earth beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. Be clear of one thing. God alone determines how he is to be worshiped. Yes, go back in the Old Testament, there were a number of indications supporting that fact. The first commandment prohibits worship of other gods. God is spirit, John 4:24, and his worshipers must worship in spirit and truth. This was Jesus' conversation with the Samaritan woman at the well, of course. If the second commandment about images is to add anything to the first, it must prohibit the use of created images to worship even him. Why is that? Well, I think it's because any man-made image that is intended to represent God will always be corrupted, since man has imperfect and incomplete knowledge of God. God is spirit. Remember, scholars will tell you that the knowledge of God is incomprehensible. You cannot fully understand who he is, what he is, his attributes. You can understand some of them, those he has revealed. You cannot understand what he has not revealed. So if you make something according to your interpretation, it's going to end up being corrupt in some way, shape, or form. I take this command, or the second commandment, to include, among other things, statues, pictures, man-made philosophical systems like Darwinian evolution, Marxism, any view of God which denies any of his attributes, that is, making God less than he is, the point at which Christians may be in the greatest peril of worshiping another God. They're worshiping a God who is too small. I think that was what Paul Little's position, that your God may be too small. Anything that takes priority in your life takes priority over God and His will is to you an idol and something that is in effect worshipped. Well, the only true ideas about God, where do they have to come from? There's only one ultimate source of authority: God's Word, the Bible. By the way, going back to this idea of giving them over, that wasn't new, because similar references in the Old Testament, I'll give you several here. Most of them relate to God giving the enemies of Israel over to Israel, but let's take a look at them. Numbers 21 verse 3. The Lord listened to Israel's plea and gave the Canaanites over to them. They completely destroyed them and their towns, so the place was named Hormah. So God gave the Canaanites, the enemies of Israel, the ones they were displacing out of the land, He gave them over in judgment so that Israel could destroy them. Judges 11:32. When Jephthah went over to fight the Ammonites, remember those are cousins of the Jews. The Ammonites are descending from Lot's son or grandson through his younger daughter named Ammon. So Jephthah went over to fight these cousins, and the Lord gave them, the Ammonites, into Jephthah's hands. So again, he took the enemy of Israel, judged them, and let Israel defeat them. Psalm 78:50 says, He prepared a path for His anger. He did not spare them from death, but gave them over to the plague. He's talking about Egyptians being given over to the plagues during the Exodus. So, well, let's continue. I still have a couple more to go here. Psalm 81, verses 11 and 12. But my people would not listen to me. Israel would not submit to me. This is God speaking, of course. So I gave them over to their stubborn hearts to follow their own devices. So God told the nation of Israel, look, you don't want to follow me? Fine. You go ahead and do what you want. See what happens. Judges 3:12. Once again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And because they did this evil, the Lord gave Eglon, king of Moab, power over Israel. So Israel was given over to an enemy in this case because of their insistence on disobeying him. So notice two things. The judgment may be against one's enemies, but even if you are a child of God, if He gives you over, you are being disciplined, and that judgment may be severe depending upon why God gave you over, what the evil was that you were committing. Paul then moved to the second cycle and exchange is man without God in this particular case. So let's go back to Romans chapter 1 verses 25, 26, and 27. Talking about the pagans again. They exchanged the truth of God for a lie. There's a swap. They did not pay attention to what they knew about God. They suppressed it, as we saw earlier last time. They suppressed the truth of God and accepted in its place a lie. What were they doing? Worshiping and serving the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. Because of this, God handed them over to what? To the consequences, to dishonorable passions. For women exchanged the natural use of their bodies for that use which is against nature. Likewise, men, leaving the natural use of the woman, you can guess what it's referring to, burned in their desire for one another, men with men, doing that which is shameful, and receiving in themselves, here's the consequences, the just penalty that was necessary for their error. So what's the perversion? They exchanged the truth of God for a lie and fell into full-blown idolatry. The wholesale rejection of God and His truth is seen in that case, because that's just all-out rejection of what God says. Now, these pagans chose to worship idols of their own creation. And every idol is the creation of man, and every creation of man is typically an idol. There's no longer any pretext that the idols are merely symbols of the true God designed as age to worship. Not anymore. It's out and out idolatry. The retribution, the payback, God gave them over to shameful lusts. Well, God's next act of judgment resulted in their giving full rein to sexual impurity. Even the women, which would have been very surprising to Romans, they had a different view. The result, well, it's quite clear. It's homosexuality. Greek culture taught that homosexual love is of the purest kind of love. We know that not to be true, but that's what the Greeks taught. 14 of the first 15 Roman emperors of Caesar's were homosexual. Paul was dealing with a very corrupt society, and he's laying it wide out in the open. That didn't sound too good. Idolatry, coupled with constant immoral behavior, leads inevitably to bizarre behaviors and acts of worship. What are some? Child sacrifice, prostitution, drugs, you name it. The natural result at this level of rebellion is blatant homosexual behavior. Sins that carry their own penalties, and the penalties are both just, right, that is, and necessary. Note, you want to observe that the biblical warnings are not warnings against sexual orientation. That's interesting, but it's against perverse sexual behavior. The question is not one of identity, but obedience. The 70s in the U.S. increased restraints on the promotion of biblical beliefs. An explosion of Eastern religion and New Age philosophies, and a popularizing of sympathy for the homosexual agenda under the guise of civil rights for a disadvantaged people group. So this nation started that downhill cycle, essentially, that Paul's been describing for the Romans. But if you remember at our very introductory sessions, we spoke of how close Rome in Paul's day looked like the United States of today. So, is God judging the United States as a nation? I'm pretty well convinced we are there, and I'm very convinced that we're going to be disciplined by God as a nation in the very near future. I don't think that would be unreasonable. As a matter of fact, if that discipline would bring the nation back to God, which is what it's always intended to do, it was true of Israel. Its discipline, its judgments were always aimed at reconciliation of the nation with God. So if God were to go put us through some strong form of discipline to bring us back to Him, I think I'd vote for it. I wouldn't be pleased with what it would cost us individually and nationwide, but if it brings us back to God, the discipline would be worth it. Now, some will try to tell you that idolatry is just a tool for worshiping one's own God. However, in God's view, idolatry is a falling away from the truth, ending in the rejection of the Creator and His revelation, the worship of things from creation rather than the worship of God Himself. So this segment, verses 25 through 27, also tells us that monotheism predates polytheism. Most people will tell you that polytheism came first. That isn't true. Remember what Paul said? They all knew there was a God, not many gods. Those people knew of the one true God before they rejected that knowledge and turned to idolatry. The downward trend to this point, listen to this: ungodliness, idolatry, immoral sexual behavior, homosexuality. So what is next? Well, come back for the next session, and we'll finish chapter 1 of the book of Romans. Maybe.